Amen.
Okie doke.
I've said so many times that every time I go through John, and I've been through John numerous times, something new, something different jumps out. I need to apologize because there was something that jumped out last week after the fact. So I didn't call you all up or get you all back on Zoom to talk about it, but it was one of those that, I always just kind of rehash the series or the session and just kind of put it to bed. Last week we saw where Jesus was praying for his disciples. And he said, Father, protect them by your name, the name that you have given me. And then you kind of fast forward to that and you get that powerful scene in the garden when they come to arrest Jesus and he simply speaks God's name. And the soldiers all kind of fall down in fear. It's like, duh, let's put two and two together, protect them by your name. And he uses that name to set that stage to protect them. I'd never noticed that juxtaposition before, how quickly that followed his prayer. But that's the beauty of all of this is, things just kind of jump out and say, hey, look at me, look at me. And especially through this section, there's a lot of things that simply jump out that aren't so much a given as you have to kind of read into it. One of those things is this interplay that we have between Peter and Jesus and everything that's going on. And I love how John uses these scenes to kind of paint that portrait of Peter. And I've said before that Peter is that literary archetype of humanity. Peter is us. And how Peter, on one hand, can be standing there firmly confessing his faith, and on the next, he can be this quivering mound of jello in the corner. And it goes back and forth, but through it all, we see Jesus being steadfast in his love, and at the end, we see that forgiveness that he brings Peter for being stupid and being Peter and being human. And this little section is one of those. John uses this really interesting technique of jumping back and forth. If this were a movie, it would be, here's this scene here, we're talking about Peter, then we're going to jump over here and we're going to talk about Jesus. Then we're going to jump back here and talk about Peter. And it kind of cuts back and forth. And he does that on purpose. He does that to set this section aside and say, we're focusing on two different things that are interrelated. It's this relationship that Peter has with Jesus and Jesus has with all of humanity. And remember, Jesus had predicted that Peter was going to deny him not just once, but 3 times in a very short time. And so we're starting to see that come into play here. So who would like to read verse 15 through 18 for me, please? Go for it, Susan.
Couldn't get my mute off.
Oh, no.
Okay. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. As this disciple was known to the high priest, he entered the court of the high priest along with Jesus, while Peter stood outside at the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the maid who kept the door and brought Peter in. The maid who kept the door said to Peter, "Are not you also one of this man's disciples?" He said, "I am not." Now the servants and officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself.
Thanks. Peter, old brash fisherman. He gets sidetracked. And it wasn't one of the scary guards. It wasn't a Roman soldier. It was a servant girl. And the way that word is used, that servant girl, she's really about 13 years old. Nothing to be really afraid of, is it? Of course, if you've ever been around 13-year-old girls, you know it's something to be afraid of. They can be a little crazy sometimes. It was something or someone rather small and insignificant in the grand scheme of things. That's what tripped Peter up. And then the next two denials follow rather quickly afterwards. But, you know, that's kind of the nature of sin. Something happens and we get caught off guard, sometimes by something rather insignificant. But next thing you know, we've slid further and further and further away. And I love how John kind of paints that picture here. Because again, Peter represents us. And that's our nature as human beings. You know, our hearts are prone to wander. But the other thing that John does here is kind of set up this almost a competition between he and Peter that he carries out all the way through the end of the story. He doesn't name himself. He never does. John never names himself in his gospel. He's always just called himself the other disciple, sometimes the disciple that Jesus loved. But we see this. They're both following, but John knows somebody. He has a connection at the high priest's. He goes into the courtyard. Peter stays behind. He can't get in there. And John is the one who arranges for Peter to come in. They're standing there around this fire. If you're standing around a fire, you're not just standing there silently, you're chit-chatting back and forth. But imagine how it is for Peter. Jesus has already been arrested. He's kind of behind enemy lines, if you want to use that military analogy. They're standing around a fire. Somebody's already pointed out that, are you one of those followers of Jesus? And he's already said no. Now, the logical thing would have been for Peter to just get out of there. Just back away from that situation. When you find yourself stuck in a place that you know you probably shouldn't be, and you've already kind of crossed a line and said something that you probably shouldn't have said, you're already starting to go down that slippery slope of sin. That's not easy to say, by the way, slippery slope of sin. Be a good song title. But you're already going down that road. As we say in the business world today, put a pin in it. Stop it there and back away. Peter doesn't do that. Peter doesn't do that. But now, John shifts gears. He goes from talking about Peter to talking about Jesus. Jesus is coming before the high priest to be questioned. So who would like to read verse 19 through 24 for me, please? Go for it, Diane.
Okay. Then the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. Jesus answered, I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in the synagogues and in the temple where all the Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who heard what I said to them. They know what I've said. When he had said this, one of the police standing nearby struck Jesus on the face, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered, "If I have spoken wrongly, testify to the wrong. But if I have spoken rightly, why do you strike me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest.
Thanks. John wants us to see through all of this that Jesus is in charge. Starting with that confrontation in the garden when they came to arrest him. He made it very clear that he's in control, and he's going to keep showing us all through this narrative that Jesus is in charge of the situation, no matter how wrong it is. There are so many things wrong with this trial of Jesus. He actually has two trials. He has the Jewish trial, and then he has the Roman trial. There's so many things wrong with this Jewish trial. Number one, it's taking place at night. And especially if they're trying to bring a death sentence. Any trials that involved capital punishment could not take place at night. They had to start one day and finish the next day. The accused was innocent until proven guilty. He wasn't supposed to be able to self-incriminate. You could have no physical confrontation. You couldn't hit or slap or kick or anything the prisoner until he had been proven guilty. And the charges have to be brought by a witness or witnesses. None of that is happening. What you have is Jesus being confronted by Annas. Annas wasn't even the reigning high priest. He was the father-in-law of Caiaphas. But there's great speculation, and many scholars tend to agree that it was Annas who wanted to get rid of Jesus, because he still represented the old school legal system, if you will. And he didn't like Jesus. He didn't like the things that Jesus said and did or taught. And Jesus kind of points that out here. He said, I've taught openly. I've taught plainly. Why are you asking me what I said? Ask the witnesses. Ask the ones who are supposed to be here. And I think at this point, Annas realized that he's in over his head confronting Jesus, because Jesus knows the system. He knows what should be happening. And he simply just says, take him away, sends him on to the reigning high priest. But what I love about this is Jesus is still watching out for his disciples. If the Jewish religious authorities didn't want Jesus, they certainly didn't want his disciples around either. And so Annas even questions him, questions about his teaching, but also about his disciples. What does Jesus say about his disciples in this interaction? Nothing. Says nothing. He is going to make sure that those guys are protected. He doesn't want them drugged into this, especially knowing how illegal this whole proceeding is. The other thing that I really love about this is how we can contrast Peter and Jesus in their response. Peter was easily sidetracked by a little 13-year-old servant girl. Jesus is standing in the face of a corrupt religious leader and remains steadfast to his purpose. He knows what he's come to do. He knows what he is about to face, and he is not going to let anything detract from that. Because at any point through all of this, he could have simply thrown up his hands and said, "This is silly, folks," and just walked away. But he didn't do that. Instead, he remained focused on what he came to do, and he doesn't get sidetracked. He doesn't go down rabbit trails trying to get revenge, trying to point out things. He simply keeps focused on what it is he's come to do. Boy, we can learn from that. We can really learn from that, because how easy is it for us? How easy is it for me to talk? How easy is it for us to get sidetracked? Sometimes even by things that we think are worthy and noble, we kind of get pulled off into a different direction, and we take our eyes off what we are truly intending to do. That's another juxtaposition that John is showing us here between Peter and the humanity and Jesus and his divine sense of purpose. Who would like to read verse 25 through 27, please? A little short one. Catherine, go for it.
As Simon Peter stood warming himself, he was asked, "You are not one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it, saying, "I am not." One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. "Didn't I see you with him in the olive grove?" Again, Peter denied it, and at that moment, a rooster began to crow.
Thanks. Peter's kind of trapped here. Again, he's around that fire. The smart thing would have been to realize that this is not a good situation and walk away. He doesn't do that. And so now when he's challenged again, he's already been caught in a lie. So what do? What's our human nature? To continue to cover ourselves because we don't want to be caught. Even when he's directly confronted by somebody who was there, a relative of the guy who got his ear lopped off, Peter stands firm in that denial. Says, "Wasn't me." Kind of the old Bart Simpson defense. "Wasn't me, didn't do it, can't prove a thing." Now that's Peter. That's our human nature. It really is. The more we're pushed when we're caught in something, quite often the more we dig our heels in and get adamant about being right. But now we see why Jesus is going to go through what he went through, because that's us. We can justify our behaviors 8 ways to Sunday. Sometimes by pretending we didn't do it, sometimes by pretending we didn't mean to do it, sometimes just simply by changing the subject or challenging our accusers. Kind of a contrast to what Jesus is going to do through this whole thing. But that's why he's going through all of that. But also notice how quickly that second and third denial followed. Again, that's kind of the nature of sin. When we start down that slope and we expose ourselves and allow ourselves to be drug into situations and places or responses that we know we shouldn't be doing, it becomes very easy after that to continue that pattern and practice. I liken sin to this whirlpool in my bathtub when I pull the plug and it starts to drain the water. It just gets more and more powerful and draws more and more stuff down that drain. And it happens really quickly. That's what it does to us. It grabs us and starts to spin us around, and pretty soon we are sucked down that drain. Sometimes before we even have a chance to react. Welcome to being human, folks. That's what it looks like, and that's what we do. But that's why Jesus came, and that's why Jesus died. But I also love how Annas here said, I can't deal with this, and pushes Jesus away. Sends him off to somebody else. So who would like to read verse 28 through 32 for me? Hulda, go for it.
They led Jesus then from Caiaphas to the Roman governor's palace. It was nearly morning. They themselves didn't enter the palace because they didn't want to be disqualified from eating the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and spoke. What charge do you bring against this man? They said, if he hadn't been doing something evil, do you think we'd be here bothering you? Pilate said, you take him, judge him by your law.
Excuse me. Thank you. What's missing in this section? Susan?
Jesus isn't talking. And
Pardon?
Jesus isn't talking at all in this.
Jesus isn't talking at all? What else? Diane?
They don't have an accusation. When he asks what's the accusation, they don't have any answer for it.
Yeah. Catherine?
They don't show where he is before I can't say his name is right.
Caiaphas?
Yeah.
Yeah,
They
yeah,
don't
that's
show
what's
that
missing.
part. Yeah.
That's what's missing. Annas sent him away to Caiaphas,
Caiaphas.
and
Okay.
suddenly now we're standing before Pilate. Why do you think John does that? Catherine?
Some of the other disciples told about it. Matthew, Mark, I think probably some of them did.
Yeah.
He must not have considered it that important.
Bingo. It wasn't that important. It really wasn't. Because in the grand scheme of things, what the lying, scheming, conniving religious leaders were up to really didn't matter. it truly wasn't that important. Again, what John is trying to show us here is that Jesus is in control. So why bother with an interaction with Caiaphas? It's just extra words that don't need to be said, because he's setting the stage now for something grander. Is you had this hierarchy. You had the local Jewish religious authorities who had their own set of rules and laws and things to go by. And then you had the Roman rules and laws and hierarchy. When Rome would come in and take over a region, they allowed the people to keep their own religious practices, their own kind of sense of governance and order, because they realized that if they tried to change all of those things, that people are going to rebel and revolt, and they're not going to be very happy citizens. So you allow them to do their stuff to a point, but you're there as the overseer of it all. And when things started to get a little out of hand, the Romans would come in and crush whatever was taking place. So John is showing us here that Jesus has already addressed that lower level of power, and now he's moving up to the next level of power. But yeah, there's no accusation. There's no charges. All they say is, well, trust us. If he weren't a criminal, we wouldn't be bothering you at this hour. How would you like to be put on trial with those as the base charges? Yeah. Diane?
How low was Pilate in the Roman hierarchy compared to the Caiaphas?
Caiaphas wasn't in the Roman hierarchy at all. He was in the Jewish hierarchy.
Okay, so how low was Pilate? He wasn't the top authority, was he?
He was the top authority in that region.
He was, okay.
Yeah.
Was he governor?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing that I think is ironic about this, the Jewish authorities were so bent on getting rid of Jesus that they were willing to break every rule that they had regarding civil trials. But on the other hand, they were so focused on making sure that they got to celebrate Passover that they refused to go into Pilate's residence, because that would make them unclean. They would have to go through this 7-day period of purification. Entering a Gentile household was being an unclean act. They didn't want to miss the feast. So instead, they had Pilate come out to them. Boy, did these guys really miss it. That's quite literally putting the letter of the law above the person. They were more concerned about following the quote unquote rules in regards to something that was important to them, celebrating Passover, versus something that should have been more important, which is the life of an innocent person. Boy, how often do we do that ourselves as society? We're so focused on being a stickler for the rules that apply to us are the ones that we want to follow, that we lose sight of the humanity in the process. And that's been a struggle from the very beginning. And that's going to continue to be a struggle. But the one thing that cuts through all of that is Jesus. As long as we make him the center of things. The other things that we seem to think are so gosh darn important just kind of fall by the wayside. And we become a little more clear on what our purpose should be. Are we supposed to be a stickler for rules? If so, then apply them equally to everybody, including yourself. You know, we get to watch that play out nationally all the time on the news as we see all these different trials that are happening. Are we a nation of law and order and rules? Then they should apply equally across the board. Or do people in power get to pick and choose? And this is happening on both sides of the equation. It's no different than here. The people in power get to pick and choose what rules apply to them and what rules don't. That has been the Pharisees' modus operandi for years. They get to pick and choose what rules they want to follow and what rules apply to everybody else. Excuse me. Who would like to read 30? Let's go back to 31. Read 31 through 38 for me, please. Or through 37. Sharon, go for it.
Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," the Jews objected. This happened so that the words Jesus had spoken indicated the kind of death he was going to die would be fulfilled. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked. "Or did others talk to you about me?" Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "It was your people and your chief priests who handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You are right in saying I am a king. In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" Pilate asked. With this he went out again to the Jews and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him. But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas. Give us Barabbas." Now Barabbas had taken part in a rebellion.
Thanks. Pilate. Yes, Susan.
Mine says that Barabbas was a robber.
Mine says freedom fighter.
That's really close to what it is. He had led a rebellion against Rome. Kind of think of him as Robin Hood, because it's a little bit of both. Susan's is correct and Hulda's is correct. He was leading a revolt against Rome, which is why he's in jail and why he is going to be dead. You did not rebel against Rome, period. That would be the last prisoner that Pilate would want to release. But that's the one that the Jews asked for. We're getting ahead of ourselves here, but we'll have that in the back of your mind. Pilate is facing a no-win situation here. He's questioning Jesus, and Jesus isn't giving any sort of defense because he hasn't really been accused of anything. So now this inquiry is kind of turning into finding out who this Jesus guy is. And Pilate asks him flat out, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus' response, "Is that your idea, or did somebody else put that in your head?" He's showing Pilate here again that he's no ordinary prisoner. He's no ordinary criminal. That's a yes or no question. Are you the king of the Jews? Yes or no? Does Jesus give a yes or no answer? Jesus seldom gives a yes or no answer. But instead, he's kind of pushing back on Pilate. And Pilate wants to know who Jesus is, and Jesus is going to push back to figure out where's Pilate coming from. He's going to start planting these seeds of doubt in Pilate. Yes, Catherine.
In my Bible, my study Bible, the footnote was interesting on that. It said, "Are you king of the Jews?" Pilate's first words to Jesus. No, that wasn't it either. "Is it your own idea? If so," Pilate's question had meant, "Are you a rebel?" If the question had originated with the Jews, it meant, "Are you the Messianic king?"
Yep.
So I thought that was
beat me to it. Yep, but that's
oh,
it.
I'm sorry. Okay.
No, that's okay. That's okay. Because either way, Pilate's in trouble. Because if Jesus is a rebel, now he has to worry about this guy and this revolt and all of his followers, and he's dealt with that many times. But if he truly is the Messiah, the Messianic king, this is opening up a whole nother can of worms. And Jesus doesn't come right out and say one way or the other. All he says is, "My kingdom's not of this world." And he says, if I were a political king, my followers would come and set me free. Pilate is starting to realize here that this is somebody he doesn't want to mess with. Because if he truly is the Messiah or the Messianic king, he doesn't want to mess with God, even though he doesn't really believe in God, doesn't worship him. He's not a Jew. That's what he said. So he's giving himself an out. And Jesus isn't taking it. He really isn't taking it. But what he does do is say why he's here. Very cryptically. But he simply says, yeah, I am a king. But this is why I've come into the world. What he's saying is, I've come here to do this, to die. Pilate doesn't understand what he means. Not at all. What he understands is he doesn't want to mess with this. So he's going to do the thing and push him right back. We see this happening a lot. People don't know what to do with Jesus, so they kind of push him away and push him off to somebody else. Boy, that sounds familiar today, doesn't it? People just don't know what to do with Jesus. people who don't know Jesus kind of want to push him aside and ignore it or challenge it or say it's not true or whatever human wisdom and logic they try to come up with. Sadly, sometimes even the church, the religious establishment, just doesn't know what to do with Jesus. What do we do with this guy? It kind of upsets the way we want to have things done. Now, when you start bringing this Jesus guy into things, it really messes things up. Pilate figures he's got this great out. It's Passover. And there's a custom that to placate the people, the Romans would release one prisoner, set them free, drop all charges, and that would be good. They kind of wanted to throw that little bone to the Jewish people. The people don't want Jesus. They want Pilate to release Barabbas. We've already talked about kind of who he is. Little interesting, ironic thing. His name, Barabbas. Bar, the prefix, son of. Abbas, Abba, son of the Father. Boy, how close were they? How close were they to actually releasing the son of the Father? But instead, they released the son of a father. Not the father, but a father. Susan.
This definition of Barabbas as being like Robin Hood gives me a totally different image that I always had the idea that he was a bad guy. And this kind of changes that.
Yeah, that's how he supported his revolt. He didn't like Rome. He wasn't the first one. He's not going to be the last one. But that was the one thing that the Roman government would not stand for. Somebody rebelling against them. Those revolts were always met swiftly, and with fierce action. But it shows us also a little glimpse of the Roman legal system and their desire for justice. Barabbas was going to end up dead. It would have been real easy for them just to, instead of putting him in chains and bringing him in and sending him off to prison and go through a trial and all that, it would have been real easy for them just to kill him out in the field. No one would care. But they would know that they had done it wrong. There was a system to their judgment and their justice. They didn't want it to come back on them that they had done something wrong. That's why Pilate struggles so much over the fact that he doesn't see anything wrong with Jesus. He's innocent. There's no charges. Can't find anything wrong with the guy except he's way above my league intelligent-wise. He even gonna send him back to the Jews. And the Jews say, we don't have the right to put somebody to death, which is not true. They could have taken outside the city and stoned him. In fact, we see earlier that they tried to do that. They had that right. And Rome would have allowed that to happen. They just didn't want to be the ones to be guilty. They wanted to just kind of wash their hands and say, no, it's Rome. Rome is doing all of this. They were trying to save face because they knew that Jesus had a bunch of followers. And if they were the ones who had him stoned and put to death, pretty soon they're going to have that band of followers coming after them. So rather than doing it that way, they just simply passed the buck on to somebody else. Jesus is like this thing we'd call a political football, back and forth between two sides that nobody really wants to deal with him. Nobody wants him, but nobody wants to be the one to truly deal with him. So who would like to read in chapter 19, 1 through 7 for me, please? Susan, go for it.
Then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him, and the soldiers plaited a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, "Behold, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no crime in him." So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no crime in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and by that law he ought to die, because he has made himself the Son of God."
Thanks. It wasn't just the Jewish trial. It was the Roman trial that was so unjust and so unfair. Pilate had Jesus flogged. That's a word that we don't use much today. We kind of frown upon flogging. The Romans were experts at flogging. At the risk of sounding too graphic, Pilate was hoping that by simply flogging Jesus, it would be enough to placate the crowd. They had people who were experts in whipping somebody literally to within an inch of their life. One more lash and Jesus would have died. And quite often they would do it incrementally. They would bring the prisoner up to a point. And when it looked like they were ready to pass out or die, they would back away and then come back again and do it again. And it would be on a bare back. And they used what medieval torturers would call a cat of nine tails, a handle with 9 leather thongs coming off the end of it. And at the end of those leather thongs, they would usually put either shards of metal or broken glass and just come up and start whipping on somebody's back. By the time they were done with Jesus, his back would have looked like hamburger. And yet he did not protest. They put a purple robe on him. It's mockery. Purple's the royal color. They put a crown of thorns on his head. You ever handled a crown of thorns, by the way? I had one at the place at the nursing home that we would use on Good Friday. We put on a little wooden cross on the altar. Man, I hated just to pick that thing up because you always got pricked with it. That's like rose bushes on your head. They mocked him. And then they played the game with him. They would either blindfold him or have him turn around, and they would take turns. You'd have a group of soldiers taking turns and just beating on him as hard as they could. One at a time, they'd each get a punch in, except for one person. And then they would say, who was it who didn't hit you? And if they guessed wrong, they got to beat on him again. They kept doing that until he finally got it right. That's what Jesus is going through. His back would have looked like hamburger. His face would have looked like he'd just gotten beaten with a baseball bat. Because Roman soldiers were pretty cruel and vicious. That's the physical stuff that Jesus was going through. And all through it, in the back of his mind, was the thing that was going to be even worse. Because he knew that when he hung on the cross, that God was going to eventually turn his back on him. The physical pain is one thing. That spiritual pain of knowing that God is going to abandon you, when that's all you've ever known from the existence of existence, that was weighing on his mind. And he knew all of that going into this willfully. But then the Jews finally kind of made some sort of accusation. He says, well, he claimed to be the Son of God. That's going to change things. We've got time for one more little section here. Who would like to read verses 8 through 16 for me? Catherine, go for it.
Let's see. Where do we start?
8 through 16.
Okay. When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. Where do you come from? He asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. Do you refuse to speak to me? Pilate said. Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you? Jesus answered, you would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jews kept shouting, if you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar. When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of Passover week, about the 6th hour. Here is your king, Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, take him away, crucify him. Shall I crucify your king? Pilate asked. We have no king but Caesar, the chief priests answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified.
Thanks. I like how when Pilate heard the accusation that he claimed to be the Son of God, I like how John says he was even more afraid, which kind of tells us that he was afraid of this whole process going in, probably because he didn't really know what the outcome was going to be, what the repercussions were going to be. But now it takes it to a whole new level. and Pilate wants nothing to do with it. And he just wants to get rid of Jesus and give him back to the people. And Pilate tries to pull rank and do this little power trip saying, don't you know that I have the power to crucify you? Why don't you answer me? And Jesus simply said, you don't have any power except what's given from above. But then he says something, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. Who do you think he meant?
Caiaphas?
Caiaphas?
The Jewish priests and people.
Jewish priests and people.
Sanhedrin?
Sanhedrin? Anybody
Not
else?
God. Not God. I can't. He isn't guilty. I don't know.
Annas?
Annas?
It's weird because it's singular. And it's hard to find a singular person who's totally responsible, unless he's going like for the evil one or the devil or something like that.
We're back to
Bingo.
Judas.
Good.
Bingo. All of those other people were ancillary players in this play. And it's really, well, all of us, all of humanity is guilty of handing Jesus over to be crucified because we're all sinners. So this is a trick question with two different levels. The one, if he's talking about the one, he's talking about each and every human being who's ever lived. But they're also just kind of puppets and pawns in the greater scheme of this story, and the one who's really responsible for handing Jesus over to be crucified is Satan, the evil one. It's like I said from the very beginning, this is a story that has several layers and several characters to it. You have the hero, which is Jesus, and you have the anti-hero, the enemy, which is Satan. This is the ultimate battle between good and evil. Poor Pilate doesn't understand that. Hulda, yes.
Just thinking that Pilate kind of reminds me of Peter on the Roman side. And I didn't count, but he kind of, is it 3 times that he tries to not have him
Yeah.
tortured?
Yeah. Let's push him away. Let's push him away. Yeah.
I mean, he kind of hears the truth in Jesus, but then he denies it ultimately.
What is truth?
Right.
There's a guy who didn't want to engage in a philosophical debate. He just wanted to keep it plain and simple.
And it
'Cause he's trying
establishes him as not a member of the kingdom because he can't hear
Yep.
the truth.
Yep. The other thing about this interaction I find really fascinating and hypocritical of the religious leaders, when they said, we have no king but Caesar.
Hmm.
Mm.
Yeah, that was
Really? Weren't these the same guys who early on in Jesus's ministry, when they're talking about being children of Abraham, we're children of Abraham, we haven't been slaves to anybody. But suddenly when you kind of get pushed on that, You're going to say whatever is easiest. And no. We worship Caesar. We worship Caesar. Because they're also afraid of Pilate. And Pilate's afraid of Jesus. It's this, the people are afraid of Pilate. Pilate's afraid of Jesus. And Jesus isn't afraid of anyone or anything. And all through this, he's simply marching to his destiny. And he knows it, and he knows what it's going to be like. He's already experiencing the physical pain that he has to endure. I mean, can you imagine hanging on a cross with your back that's bloody and beaten, this rough wooden, it wasn't this smooth, varnished surface. It was just this rough beam. And crucifixion is brutal because you basically suffocate. Because you're hanging like this and you've got your weight there and you're trying to breathe. And in order to breathe, you've got your feet that are nailed. You're pulling up with your hands and pushing up with your feet just to get your lungs to expand. And then you have to let go and slide back down. And then you keep doing that. That's why the Romans would come through and break the legs of people who were taking too long. Now imagine sliding up and down that wooden cross with a back that looks like 5 pounds of Cubs Beth's ground beef. Not pretty. Not pretty. The Romans were experts at torture and killing. They didn't want it to be quick and painless. Kind of like humanity. We're experts at lots of stuff that Jesus doesn't like. But yet through it all, he keeps his focus right in front of him. He doesn't get sidetracked. Even any one of those encounters could have been an hours long debate or longer had he chosen to. Instead, he simply just kind of brushed that aside. Like they were trying to brush him aside. He was kind of just deflecting whatever it is they're coming his way. And just kept steadfastly marching on to the cross. So I'm going to shut up. I've already gone a couple of minutes over. I apologize for that, but sometimes I get on a roll. I'm sorry. But it does get better. It's kind of brutal and gory right now. But trust me, we know the story and how it ends. So thank you, folks. Have a wonderful day, wonderful rest of the week, and see you Sunday.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you, Basil.